Okay, let's quickly go over what's included in the box with the Aful Performer 5. You have the IEMs and the cable, of course. You have a nice assortment of tips, and here's an up close of the tips right here. They're similar to spin fits, except the domes are a little bit stiffer. Red is for right, left is for blue. Then you have a pretty cool case here. It's a hard plastic. The IEMs fit in there quite nicely, and it feels very protective. Okay, now let's talk about the specifications, design, build, comfort, and isolation. Before we jump in, if you like my videos, please take a second and hit the subscribe button. And also, the Performer 5 is now exclusively available on Hi-Fi Go. So, at the end of this video, be sure and go grab yourself a pair. I'll make sure and leave a link in the description. All right, let's jump in. The Aful Performer 5 comes in at $219 and has a hybrid configuration consisting of 4 balanced armature drivers for the mids and highs and a dynamic driver for the bass. The shell is 3D printed, but from what I understand, it's not your standard 3D printing technology. And I don't want to spend too much time going over specs because I know the most important thing is the sound performance, but at the same time, the amount of technology that has been put into this IEM that only cost $219 is pretty impressive, and because of that, I feel it warrants mentioning. So apparently this method they used to construct the shells is a newer type of technology used generally mostly in the medical field, and it's supposed to be a much more precise method compared to the traditional method of 3D printing. So this approach utilizes a type of 3D printing which implements ultra precision medical grade 3D printing technology. And again, this method is not only used in the construction of the outer shell, but it's also used for the internal structure as well. So the acoustic tubes and also the mounts for the balanced armatures and the dynamic driver inside of the shell are all created using this method of 3D printing. And here's the thing, the length and diameter of those acoustic tubes vary based on which frequencies are traveling through them. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's important because precision matters, especially when it comes to coherence. And this method is apparently more precise than the traditional 3D printing method. And we'll find out whether or not that translates into actually improving the performance when we go into the sound. But first, let's quickly talk about the design, build, comfort, and isolation of the Performer 5. We'll go over the design first. I like the design approach they took with the faceplate. It does kind of remind me of another IEM, but anyways, that's not important. This looks and feels very nice. The finish and overall quality generally feels and looks like something you would expect from a more expensive IEM. And that goes for the cable as well. It's a 2-pin cable and has an 8-core construction, and it's terminated with a 3.5mm jack. Comfort and isolation are also very good. As you can see, the nozzles are pretty long, so I was able to get a nice deep insertion. And I was also able to achieve a really good seal, which helped reduce the outside noise. So overall, the Performer 5 has a beautiful design, excellent build quality, a good level of comfort, and it provides good isolation as well. Okay, let's move on to the sound. Okay, let's talk about the sound of the Aful Performer 5. So I think the question I should ask is, does this method they used to construct the internal acoustic structure actually translate into improved sound performance? I'm going to try to answer that the best way I know how. So let's talk about the overall sound first. The Performer 5 is what I would consider having a neutral style tuning, but with a bass boost. So while the overall sound is very balanced, the bass and mid bass are slightly elevated, giving it just a little more thump, especially with bass guitars and toms. The bass also has a really good extension down into the sub bass frequencies. And as for the rest of the frequency range, so the lower mids all the way to the upper treble, the presentation is quite neutral. The upper mid range has good energy and the treble has a really good extension. So again, giving it a neutral presentation, but with an added bass boost. And speaking of bass, we'll go ahead and just start with the bass, then we'll work our way through the mids, treble, then we'll talk about technicalities. So again, this is a hybrid and it uses a single dynamic driver for the bass frequencies. And again, we know that dynamic driver bass delivers a little more of an impactful, visceral style of bass, while BA drivers are all about speed and precision, but generally lack that slam and impact that you get from a dynamic driver. And I've talked about this before, how it's hard to achieve both control and impact. However, it just seems like a well-implemented dynamic driver gets a little closer to delivering both than most BA drivers do, especially with a more expensive hybrid or a tribrid. And again, the Performer 5 is only $219, so I don't think you can expect the level of performance you might get from, say, the Moondrop variations, and I have those right here, or like the Theaudio Oracle. However, it does hold its own compared to, say, the Moondrop Blessing 2, and dare I even say the Blessing 2 Dusk. And I wouldn't say it's necessarily better than the Dusk, but it does come really close. There is definitely a cleaner transition from the bass to the mids in both the Blessing 2 and the Dusk. And overall, it's just a better implementation of a proper bass shelf, in my opinion, with those. But remember, this is a $219 IEM compared to the $320 plus cost of those. So the bass of the Performer 5 is very clean, but I can hear just a little bit of bass bleed in the lower mids. But the good news is it doesn't muddy things up. There still seems to be a good amount of detail and texture in the lower mids, so that's good. But here's the really good part, especially if you love dynamic driver style bass like I do. The impact and slam that I mentioned earlier, the Performer 5 has it, and it's done really, really well. And not only does it provide good slam, it also gives you that visceral sensation that only a dynamic driver can provide. And again, with a really good extension all the way down into the sub bass frequencies. And again, this is a neutral presentation with a bass boost, but I don't think it's too much bass. I think it's tastefully done. My personal opinion is that if I didn't know the price of this IEM, I would have thought it would be in the same price bracket or close to the Blessing 2 or Blessing 2 Dusk. So that says a lot right there in terms of overall bass quality. Okay, now moving into the mids. So here's where the BA drivers take over. So I mentioned that there seems to be just a slight bit of bass bleed into the lower mids, but that there's still adequate detail in that area. And that certain instruments like toms and bass guitars have a little more presence because of the way the mid bass and lower mids are tuned. Now, the further you move into the mids, the more balanced it gets. So the more balanced the vocals and instruments like guitars and pianos start to sound. And that carries through to the upper mids as well. Now, one thing I noticed is that the upper mids aren't as forward as I'm used to with this style of tuning, but they aren't recessed either. The difference is very subtle, but it is noticeable. And it just seems like there's a little more distance between the listener and the lead instruments or vocalist. Otherwise, there's still excellent energy and life in the upper mids. And as for detail retrieval in the mids, again, for $219, this competes with IEMs in the $300 price bracket. So It's exceeded my expectations for its price. So yes, the detail retrieval in the mid-range is very good. Okay, now let's talk about the treble of the Performer 5. As you move from the upper mids into the lower treble, you see that same really good energy and presence that you have in the upper mids in the lower treble. And it kind of keeps the Performer 5 from falling into that blunted territory. So it has really good treble energy, but it never comes across as sharp or sibilant. And as far as my long listening sessions, it never got to the point of being piercing or ever getting fatiguing. And as for upper treble presence, the Performer 5 has, again, I'm a drummer. I like to hear that good sizzle and crispiness in hi-hats and cymbals. I like to hear that air, and this has all of that in abundance. It has a really good natural sizzle to it, and hi-hat cymbals have that crispiness that I like. And again, it has a really good amount of air, which is great for live performance. So I'm kind of seeing a pattern starting to emerge here. The bass is good, the mids are good, the treble is good, but how are the technicalities? Because this is where IEMs at this price range start to show their weakness. Let's talk about detail retrieval first. So much of the detail retrieval, or the perception of detail retrieval, depends on the tuning in the upper mids and treble. And the tuning here is done really well. So the detail retrieval of the Performer 5 is much better than I would expect from an IEM at this price. And while I wouldn't say, again, it's as good as the Blessing 2, I would say it competes for sure with the 7 Hz Timeless, which is saying a lot because that's a really good IEM. And now when it comes to soundstage and imaging, the Performer 5 does a really good job as well. As a matter of fact, I would consider the soundstage to be above average width for an IEM. And the imaging is also above average, again, especially for an IEM at this price point. So again, like I said earlier, there was this pattern emerging, and it seems like the overall theme of this review has been that in virtually every category, the Performer 5 actually lives up to its name and performs not just well for its price, but performs as good, or in some cases better, than IEMs that cost much more. So the Performer 5, in my opinion, is the perfect name for this IEM. And I have to say, this might be my new standard at this price point. This is a great IEM for $219. And again, this is available. The Performer 5 is available now exclusively at hifigo.com. Just follow the link in the description. So that concludes my review of the Aful Performer 5. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please like this video, please share this video, and please hit the subscribe button. I hope you guys have an awesome day.